Welcome to the Sales Readiness podcast brought to you by SBI. Each episode features an unfiltered conversation between our host, SBI's Managing Director, Ray Makela, and an industry expert about the strategies, skills, and solutions that drive sales performance to the next level. These conversations are packed with expert advice, real-world examples, and practical tips to help you close deals, lead teams, and outperform the competition. In this episode, Ray is joined by SBI partner Ethan Radoff to break down the critical role of trust and emotional connection in sales success. Explore how active listening, post-sale engagement, and rapport building can elevate sales effectiveness and continue to embrace sales as a people-first business.
Hey, Ethan, welcome to the Sales Readiness podcast. How are you today?
Doing well, Ray. How are you?
Well, I'm doing well also. Hey, great to have you join us today. And as you know, we use these podcasts to dive into core selling skills and some of the core areas around our sales training and enablement. And really thrilled to have you here today to talk about a little bit of a softer topic, but one that is, I think, super critical to sales, and that's around building relationships with our customers and how critical that is. Maybe just to kick things off, we could have you share a little bit about your background and how you're coming to this topic today to have this conversation.
Sure. Excited to be here. Looking forward to the conversation. Certainly a lot that we're going to cover today. By way of background, I'm a partner here at SBI. So what does that mean? Well, I'm responsible for client relationships across the firm and delivery of all the solutions that we offer. Been in this role a little while now, but grew up in the delivery side of consulting. So in the weeds with our clients, certainly spending a lot of time with sellers, customer success individuals, and really everyone across the organization to deliver our solutions. But I spent the last 6 years in consulting, and prior to that, spent 10 years as a seller myself. A little bit of everything from small business, mid-market, enterprise. Grew up in a car dealership selling Nissans a long time ago. So certainly a lot to say about building rapport and everything that goes in with that. But yeah, looking forward to the discussion.
No, I think that's great, and I think your background is uniquely qualified to speak to this, especially when I think about trying to build the relationship with somebody walking across a car dealer, and starting there. But let's dive in. I mean, I think we've all heard about relationship is important. People buy from those that they know and like and trust. Let's talk about why that is such a critical skill in selling, and how does that influence like the long-term relationship and the long-term customer success?
Yeah, I think you said it best. It's one of those truisms that most sellers can reflect on. People buy on emotion, they back it up with logic. Some may find a way to refute that, but as long as sales continues to be a people business, I think that will always be the case in some way, shape, or form. Um, and that emotional piece is really the interaction that you have with the other person on the phone, in person, the extent of the buying group or relationships that you have in the post-sale experience. And so, you know, the product is one thing and the value you deliver to the organization is certainly important, but the relationships that you build are also equally important. And that's from the first conversation through to every interaction that you have with those individuals. And we always echo the bring value to every conversation. So when you think about how am I building rapport, how do we show up every day, well, how am I bringing value to someone on the other end of the phone or across the table? And we'll get into details and strategies
Yeah.
on how you do it, but I think as the representative of your company and face of the product, it's certainly not just one person, it's a whole team. And we'll probably dive into that as well. But how you show up every day in those interactions and build those connections with the um, other folks on the client side is just so important to the role.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really interesting to think of. It's not a one-time event, right? It used to be, oh yeah, scan the office and look for pictures and comment on them, or find out when they went to call. It's not a one and done. You are building and rebuilding, I think, throughout the sales process. to your point, and I think it is so critical. And I think that relationship becomes even more important in today's selling environment. When I think about our recent buyer friction research, we talk about you got to have a good solution, obviously, and that's almost table stakes. But the experience they have with the selling team, with the company that they're going to work with, is actually more important in the overall decision. And I think that ability to build relationship is really critical of that. One of the skills that we talk about in our sales training is this mirroring and matching, and kind of meeting the customer where they are. Can you speak to that? I mean, that can come across as a little gimmicky. I think people have heard about that, but what does that mean to you? Is that something that you've used, and you feel is an important aspect of this?
Yeah, it's definitely a tactic that I try to bring to every conversation. You never, especially in new client interactions, or just you never know who's going to be on the other end of the phone, and so you can't really show up with um, too much homework done. That being said, I always encourage doing the research and making sure you've got an objective, but that you're well read on that individual or that organization. But you show up, and sometimes someone's had a bad day, someone's through the roof ecstatic, and you don't want to be gimmicky. I think is a great way to put it. You
Hmm.
don't want it to be um, an act that you're putting on, but I think there's subtle things that you can do in those meetings, whether they're be in the room or um, over the phone or over Zoom, to sort of kind of share the vibe, if you will. As cheesy as that sounds, I think it's more of a vibe than anything. If you've got someone who's an individual, a few words, I think if you hit them over the head with emotion and you're really amped up, it's just not going to end well. I think we've all been in those situations. The opposite's a bit easier to navigate. Someone who's a bit more enthusiastic, I think you end up needing to rein those people in a little bit more. Sometimes they can be a bit long-winded, and you do want to make sure that you get to the objectives that you set out. But I think it's being observant. I think it's being authentic, understanding, hey, who is this individual? What meeting did they maybe just come from? What's the context of the conversation we're having, or the organization? And that's really where the research ahead of time is helpful, to understand where they at in whatever organizational cycle you're dealing with. um, it goes a long way. But I think being perceptive, feeling out the situation rather than coming in with a overly preconceived agenda of how you want to show up. And by no way am I saying, put on an act or be inauthentic, but I think there's some subtle things you can do to, find some commonality and be on the same wavelength as the individual. Um, and one way I like to think about it is sort of this whole being on the same side of the table as the client or as the other person on the phone. There's sometimes a misconception in sales where this is a me versus you activity. In reality, it's not. It's a me and you against the problem, and hopefully you get to a point where you make a decision, or can get to a point where we can get you to a better outcome if you're on the client success or account management side of the puzzle. But I think that goes a long way in putting you in the right set of mind to kind of get on that same wavelength as the other individual in the conversation.
No, I think it's a great call out, that they're specific but non-gimmicky things that make the individual feel more comfortable, more at ease, and it really just takes watching and listening. And I think our research as well, right? Call research just to understand that person. Like, where are they coming from? Are they more an analytical person? Are they more of a, presentation or intuitive into the spectrum? And how do we speak to them in a to your point, even pace. If somebody's fast talking and you show up with a very slow, methodical tone, they're going to probably get a little impatient and a little bored with that. Or the same thing if you're very animated and they're trying to process, they may get frustrated. So I think those are critical aspects, and we see it especially on our selling to key executives. When we talk about meeting those executives where they are, um, they don't have a lot of time for BS. And even if it feels like, oh, I'm going to spend this time building rapport, but you can build rapport by proving your value, right? And showing that you've done your homework, that you understand their problem, that you're meeting them, with something that matters to them, and then not wasting their time, which is critical. I don't know if you have thoughts on that.
Yeah, 100%. And I think this is where the homework comes into play. What's the level of the individual that I'm talking to? I think any buyer persona that you look at that is, hopefully well done is going to help you understand the emotional narrative. You might not talk to the CTO, the CIO, the CFO every day, but it's pretty well documented what those individuals care about, how much time they typically spend in a sales process. You may get them for 15 minutes. So if you try and spend 10 building, conversational chit chat as your framework for rapport, it's probably not going to work out well, or at least in my experience. So I think just being, um, prepared for the interaction you're going to have, short, sweet, value oriented, it goes a long way to building rapport with those individuals. They're taking however long out of their day and make it meaningful. And that just comes back to try and bring something valuable to every interaction, whether it's a benchmark, an insight, a piece of research, something you heard from the industry or a competitor, um, for example, something topical. I think it goes a long way. And sometimes when we think about rapport, it's just, do I like this person? Do I get along with them? Would we want to, hang out at the airport and the classic interview test? But it's not just being friendly. I think it's being valuable to that individual, especially in the professional context. Now, you may get lucky and be in person with these people. So you get an extra 5 minutes or so in the hallway. And I certainly encourage, all sellers to the extent that they can get out in the field and spend time
Yeah.
in their organizations. Um, it's tough to do it over Zoom. There are certainly ways to do it. And over time, it becomes easier. You get to know these people, but, you can usually steal a few extra minutes in person and, ask some of the more personal oriented questions or just get a bit more informal rather than the 30 minutes that we've dedicated to this conversation. And we've been,
Right.
trying to coordinate for the last month, et cetera. So we want to get down to it as fast as possible. But yeah, no, I think it really just goes a long way when you can spend the time to prep, get set up, understand who you're talking to before you get into it.
Yeah, and I think it also brings up an interesting thought of, the relationship building starts before the meeting. So to your point, it could be in the hallway, but it could even be in the email, before when you're confirming to say, by the way, I'm looking forward and, here are 3 topics and, by the way, I saw X, Y, and Z, or, maybe dropping a link to a post or something. I love your thought about, bringing something with you. We had a client in the data analytics space who talked about a gift of content, and they're like, never show up to a customer without a gift of content. Kind of like your mom taught you, don't show up empty-handed to a dinner party or whatever. So, I think if you can bring an insight or something and say, hey, by the way, I thought about you, this might be of interest, or sending it in advance, I think you've started to build that relationship, right? That connection.
Yeah, even before you get to the meeting, I'm sure a lot of the, hunters, sellers are, just trying to get that meeting. And, everything that you're doing in anticipation of that first meeting is rapport building, whether you want it to be or not. So what are you sending them? Are you just incessantly hammering them for 15 minutes or 30 minutes to get on the phone and have a conversation about their problems, their challenges, etc.? Or are you bringing an insight? I mean, you can certainly, have a call to action, but are you sharing out the latest research? Do you have your top accounts on an RSS feed, or do you have chat GPT well informed about your target prospects, so it's helping you understand what is relevant and contextual, not just, you know super high level or abstract, and
Yeah,
hoping that that works. But I think the more, not to say you should be painstakingly personal and spend a day on outreach to one individual, but, um, over time, you need to nurture these prospects and these accounts, and you can't just, be pushing your
absolutely.
your
And
agenda.
finding those connection points. Um, yeah.
Yeah. So I agree. It's
100%.
it's in
Yeah,
every
and
touch
I
point
think
how we
finding
bring
those
it.
common connection points. I'll share a quick story because I think it's a balancing act, um, where you're finding something that's of interest, that's authentic, and that you can lean in on, but doesn't cross that line. And I had a software vendor calling on me years ago, and opened up the call by asking, how was your son's soccer game last weekend? And it took me back. We'd never talked about soccer. It was an offshore firm, but I was coaching my son's soccer team at the time. They had found the schedule online that I was the coach, and saw that we had a game and asked me about that. And I'm like, well, credit for doing your research. Creepy the way you brought it up, and you haven't earned the right to talk about my kids yet. So, I think we need to be a little bit sensitive to that.
Totally. You need to be stage appropriate. If we don't
There
know
you
each
go.
other, that's not a detail I would suggest, you going to extreme lengths to figure out. But,
Yeah.
certainly a glance at this individual. Have they been in the news recently? Has the company been in the news? I think that's fair game in a professional environment. But, use common sense and better judgment to figure out, what's the line that you're not able to cross, and leave it at that.
Yep.
Get to know them over time.
Absolutely. And I think that the one other piece, and we'll move on, but having a good coach, like if we have an insider, if we have somebody that knows them, maybe somebody who's making the referral, spend that 10 minutes and just say, hey, can you tell me, how does Ethan show up? What does he care about? What's his personality like? Where is he on the disc profile or whatever that is? But boy, you can learn so much, prior, just from a conversation, and also learning if there are hot buttons or things you should stay away from, and I think that can go a long way as well.
Absolutely. I think, putting myself back in sales shoes, if I was stuck at a lower level of an organization, or, getting to know someone and trying to get access to another individual, we got that meeting, it's completely fair game. Tell me about this individual. Is there anything I should know going into this conversation? Um, Even, things not to talk about. Words matter. Some people don't like, the word strategy or training, or they want to call it something else.
Yeah.
So, if you learn something like that, it'll go a long way.
Yeah. No, that's great. Well, let's talk about one of the other skills that comes into play here to build the relationship, and that's listening skills. And though it may seem, just really foundational and something everybody knows, I find, especially with a lot of sales professionals, we don't practice it maybe as much as we should. I mean, how does that fit into the occasion, and what do we mean by, actively listening to build a relationship?
Yeah, it's a great point because it's something that I think it's overlooked as a skill. I think it's an obvious one. Hey, we show up, we need to understand what they're saying and how they're saying it, but it's it really is an art to do well, and it can be tough, right? You have a quota, you are under pressure to sell, you're thinking about the next step, but this person's having a conversation with you, and you really need to be present to hear what they're saying, how they're saying it, understand where you want to take things, and to really go deep. I think that's one of the common discovery, you know drivers we hear, say you need to go really deep in discovery, and uh, I don't think that's wrong, but it can be tough to do. You're taking notes, you've got all these things to do. So again, with the preparation, the more you can do to get ahead of that, whether it's bringing someone else so that you all have different roles on the call, whether it's note taking, listening, playing a different role, bringing an AI note taker, anything you can do so that you can be focused on what that person is saying, um, I think is important, and it's a skill, right? It's not something that you just show up and it goes well and you get that precious time with them and you don't want to waste it.
Yeah.
So, I think in the active listening piece, one, have a framework for the conversation. If it's too
Hmm.
open ended, the conversation can go anywhere, but you want a reasonable level of open endedness to learn about, the organization, the challenge, the problem before you start thinking about how we fit in. So, um, that's an important piece. But again, doing the homework, understanding what you're about to get into in the context of the sales cycle, is a really helpful piece. And then, what are the other tactical things I can do so that I can focus truly on what they're saying, and not be too distracted, um, to really take something away.
Yeah, and I think it does take it's a mindset even to just say, "Oh yeah, I want to listen. I want to get my objective across, but I'm going to listen to this person." And then we know, and there's a lot of research behind this that suggests, if people feel listened to, they feel respected and they're more likely to trust you, and they are going to come away from that with a different feeling. And so just by saying, "Oh, I understand, can you tell me more about that?" versus that, "Oh, you're just listening to respond, like a ping pong game, you're just waiting for the ball to come over
Yeah,
the net," right?
it's inauthentic. I mean, people can tell you're pushing your agenda when you're not, confirming what you just heard, even if you understood it. There's little things that you can do to really show that you're paying attention. Um, to your point on active listening, right? So, hey, did I hear you? Like, is this how I should think about that? Just to make sure, um, even pause it before you respond. I think the anticipation of, oh, I got to get to the next discovery question, or I got to get to the action item, or the next steps, wherever it might be. Like, take a breath before, think about that next question, or, go deeper. Tell me more about that. Oh, that's really interesting. I was just talking to someone who was dealing with the same thing. How have you solved that in the past, or what's working for you? um, be engaged in the conversation. Like, it's easy to tell when folks are trying to do too much, which is why I'm, always a proponent of having another person to, you know, bounce back and forth, take notes, whatever it might be. But, just little things you can think about doing to just stay engaged in the conversation. And again, back to building rapport, show them that, hey, you're there, you're present, and um, yeah, and that, you're here to help them get the most out of this too, not just get to your checklist of objectives.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I think we often uncover things that we might have missed otherwise, where, maybe it's not even the main topic, but something comes up and you're like, "Wait, can you say more about that, or can you expand on that?" And then you find out, "Oh, that's the real issue," right?
Yeah, exactly. And sometimes, we get so distracted that we blow right by it. Someone says something that's really what you want to dig into, and it's lost in the shuffle because you're worried about the next thing. So,
Yeah.
really listening and paying attention, taking notes on what those sound bites were so you can come back to them,
Yeah.
uh, is a really important piece of the active listening process.
Yeah. So, we could try these different things. Hopefully, we're prepared. We make a connection. We listen to them, but sometimes it doesn't go right, or at least we're not able to kind of break through yet. I mean, I think we've all had those challenging experiences, but do you have any suggestions for that, where you get somebody who's just, maybe disengaged? You read the body language, you're like, wow, they're not really buying into this. How do you get past that? Or is there anything you can do to still build that relationship?
Yeah, it's always tough. I mean, you want it to go well. So when you find yourself in these situations, it's, I think one, it can be disappointing, sometimes defeating. As a salesperson, you work so hard to get the conversation only for it to not go as well as you want it to. And that's not great. I think it's to not, um, not let that interaction get the better of you in the moment. A couple things to think about. One would be just staying curious, trying to figure out, why that might be. Uh, hey, this person it's not going as well as I want. Why is that? Is it that, truly there's no fit here, or I just haven't asked the right questions, or we haven't hit the topic that really resonates yet? So I certainly wouldn't advocate giving up, but maybe taking a different angle or tactic. So, staying curious in the conversation. Um, to the rapport building side, I think, leading with empathy is an important piece, not
Hmm.
any sort of disingenuous empathy, but uh, hey, we're all busy people. Maybe you caught this person on a bad day. Maybe it's worth rescheduling. But it usually goes a long way. So empathy is a good piece to just keep top of mind in any conversation, and then yeah, maybe it's not worth it. Knowing when to cut bait is a important sales skill. I think we sometimes hold on to opportunities a little too long, and sometimes it works out. A lot of times it doesn't. But maybe this isn't the right person. Maybe it's someone else, and that's okay. But hopefully you're one step closer to the right person. So
Right.
you've tried all these things, but it's okay to move on and live to fight another day.
Absolutely. Well, and I also think we shouldn't be too hard on ourselves where maybe we're misinterpreting. It could be that that's just their personality and they're not going to give you, especially with a new partner or vendor, they're not going to give you much positive encouragement, but in the same time they're going, "Oh, well this is really good." And then you find out later that they were very impressed. So I don't think we want to, be too negative. Maybe that's just the way they show up.
100%. You don't know what happened in that individual's day. They could be having a bad day, but on the research side of being prepared, maybe this is the dynamic of that persona or individual. And we should probably understand at least a little bit of that going into the conversation. For example, if you deal with procurement a lot, their job is to work with the vendors, and sometimes they have an objective, which is, I'm trying to get the best cost for my organization, and that's what they're there to do. So I think doing a little bit of that research to understand it, and you can't do all the research, but
Right.
no, it's a great point you make, and um, you know, it's an important piece.
Yeah, absolutely. And I also think it's okay to call it out if you're not making the progress or you're feeling resistance and just say, those checkpoints to say, is this meeting your expectation? Or even labeling it a little and say, it seems like you're a little bit reserved or that, this isn't resonating. Is there something else? So I think getting it out
But
there, and especially sometimes people need a little bit of a wake up and it's like, oh no, no, this is good, right?
yeah,
Or they'll tell you and give you an opportunity to course correct.
yeah, if they didn't want to be on the conversation, they probably wouldn't have taken the meeting.
100%.
Frankly, especially for a new business pursuit. I think
Yeah.
it's pretty easy to just say, "Hey, not interested. We're not going to get on the phone." But if they take the time to get on the phone, I think it's perfectly fine to call it out. Now, doing that tactfully is important, but you can make light of it. Hey, it doesn't feel like we're heading in the right direction. Just want to take a temperature check. Just make sure that, hey, we're hitting off on your objectives. So bring it back to the beginning of the call. Did we even ask, hey, what do you want to get out of this conversation today? Here are the things we talked about covering. Is there anything else that you want to make sure that we hit on today? Did
Yeah.
we have that conversation? That's a good litmus test, but I think that's a perfectly fine thing to do. If, hey, it's not going well, we tried a couple things, um, we can end the call early.
Right.
But it's
Right.
it's it's important to check in. Otherwise we get way too carried away and 30 minutes go by, and it's not where we want to be.
Yeah. Yeah. We may have our happy ears on and feel too good, or the other way around, and we thought it was a train wreck, and they're like, no, this is what I was looking for. Well, let's kind of bring this home. I guess, hopefully we work hard, we build rapport. What can we do to sustain that rapport over time? And what would you, I guess, leave the audience with in terms of kind of netting this out on building relationships?
Yeah, I think bringing it back to the beginning, it's all about bringing value, and whatever that means to the conversation that you're having on uh, the new business side, the post sales side, lower level manager, senior executive, what can you do to bring value to that interaction? And that doesn't mean value is, coming with some massive discount every conversation. It's, maybe a relevant piece of news. You're not just checking in and touching base to, further your agenda or win the next expansion opportunity or get an introduction. So, I think be mindful of that in how you're going to bring value, or maybe it doesn't warrant an interaction, but the what is this person going to get out of this interaction is an important thing to keep in mind in the rapport building process, no matter where you are in the journey of the buyer. If they don't know you or they've worked with you for 3 to 4 years, and um, in the people business, so I don't think it's untrue to think that we're only as good as our last interaction. Yes, we've built equity and relationships over time, but it's professional relationships. So being mindful of the fact that you show up authentically and try to deliver that value in every conversation is an important reminder, and not to get complacent in that process. So I think those are the things I just want to make sure that folks lead with.
No, and I think that idea and kind of a theme throughout of thinking about their perspective and that empathy, how are they, what are they trying to get out of it? How can you help them? And in my mind, I think building that relationship by putting yourself, as a consultant or servant to them, right? What is this about helping them versus I'm selling something? I think they will feel that, and I think that does help with that connection, right?
100%. Be a human at the end of the day until the AI takes the human out of the equation now. But in all seriousness, I think it's a great point, right? The empathy, the walking a mile in the buyer's shoes, all these things you're taught as a salesperson are true. You need to have that perspective so that you can show up and really drive a meaningful interaction, whatever that interaction might be.
I think that's a great place to leave it for today. So really appreciate your time, Ethan. Always enjoyed a chat, and I'm sure we'll be doing it again soon.
You've been listening to SBI's Sales Readiness Podcast with Managing Director Ray Makela hosting. Visit sbigrowth.com to read SBI's latest research, join upcoming events, or learn about SBI's GTM and training services. Don't forget to subscribe to this podcast and connect with us on LinkedIn.